Welcome back. In this set of lectures, I'm going to be talking through Malcolm Byrnes' piece on climate justice, Hurricane Katrina, and African American environmentalism. The images on this slide are from the Katrina disaster in New Orleans. This was a hurricane that hit New Orleans and led to the city being flooded severely in 2005. In the upper left, you see the roofs of houses which haven't quite yet been submerged by the water that flooded the city. Of course, there are other houses that are completely underwater that you can't see because they're underwater. In the lower left, we have a kind of plea for help on the roof of one of these houses that was, becoming submerged, asking to be rescued by helicopters if they were able to see this writing on the roof. In the upper right, there's this provocative question, where are you? FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Association. It's basically the federal agency that's in charge of helping people who've been in a natural disaster to recover their houses and water and electricity and other basic necessities. And then in the lower right-hand side of the screen is an image of a man who carried his disabled brother to the relief center here at the, this is a kind of sports complex that was serving as a center for supplies and things like that. And he carried his brother on clearly an inflatable bed used as a kind of raft to get him there. So you get a picture from these images of just how much people were struggling in the middle of this disaster, just how hard it was for people in Hurricane Katrina and in the aftermath. So Byrnes does two things in this essay. One is to describe Katrina as an example of environmental injustice. And the second is to talk about some ways that, and as an environmental injustice that disproportionately affected African Americans in New Orleans. The second thing that he'll do is point to some features of the African American intellectual tradition, that maybe you could say intellectual and cultural tradition, that may have something to contribute to environmental thought more generally. So two parts. First part, Hurricane Katrina as a case study or an example, and the second part, drawing some lessons from African American thought for environmentalism as a whole. And the starting point for making the first point about Hurricane Katrina is that the percentage of African Americans that have returned to New Orleans since the hurricane is much less than that of others who have returned. So since the hurricane, the percentage of African Americans in New Orleans dropped from 67% to 60%. And this suggests that African Americans had a harder time returning than others. Now, if you read and think about statistics, you can of course ask, are there potentially other causes than the difficulty of return that might explain this? Maybe it's some greater influx of another demographic group, maybe an influx of Hispanics that reduces the total percentage of African Americans in the city, something like that. I want to show you in just a moment a chart, not included in Byrnes' essay, but a chart that it's easy to find online that shows you that this is probably not the explanation. So if you look at this chart comparing the African American, white, and Hispanic populations between 2000 and 2020, then you see that the African American population has indeed severely declined. And it seems quite plausible to think that it's about this difficulty of returning after the disaster that Byrnes describes. You see how much, not just in terms of proportion, not just in terms of like raw numbers, but in terms of proportion, the dip is quite significant for Black residents in comparison with white and Hispanic residents. Hispanic residents the number increased, but certainly not enough to cover that enormous dip in the Black population. So the next question Byrnes asks is, why would this be? Why would African Americans have a harder time returning than others? And this leads him into a description of a number of mechanisms that support the or produce or lead to the environmental injustice in this case. So what we have to think about is the kind of different position of at least a large number of African American residents in comparison with that of white residents and other residents. And so one of these features is that, you know, African Americans in the city, a larger percentage of African Americans in the city, poor, didn't have transportation, didn't have their own transportation, cars, were reliant on public transportation, for instance, and other kinds of transportation. And that makes it harder to get back to the city if one has left because of a disaster, either because one left in order to avoid the storm or because one left in the middle or after the storm through some kind of, you know, desperate, seeking refuge or seeking, I think refuge is the right word. So however it is that people left, they may have had a hard time getting back. Whereas if you have a car or your family has a car, you could pack into the car and drive somewhere else and then drive back later. So the disaster disproportionately affected people that didn't have cars. There's also the cost of rebuilding houses. Of course, that costs a certain amount of money if your house is destroyed. If you don't have that money to use, then it's hard to rebuild a house. So it disproportionately affects those who don't have money saved in the bank. It disproportionately affects, another is that city amenities seem to have not been equally distributed or distributed in a way that would have helped Black residents to be able to return. There was less home ownership in Black communities, and it was harder for Black homeowners, those even who did have homes, to secure loans that would cover the cost of rebuilding. And then in some cases, Black residents lived in public housing, which was not housing that they owned, but housing that had been provided through some kind of, some kind of assistance program. But when that housing was destroyed, a lot of it was not rebuilt. So again, the disaster disproportionately affected those who were in such public housing rather than in their own housing. So obviously now Katrina is not responsible. Katrina, the disaster, is not the cause of these differences in situation between African Americans, whites, and others. But the pattern of a difference in these two groups, or the kind of statistical difference in these two groups that already existed, the sort of different position of a lot of Black residents from that of a lot of white residents in terms of things like finance, cars, house ownership, etc., meant that Blacks were disproportionately negatively affected by a natural occurrence. And Byrnes also connects this with the larger theme of climate change, because climate change is something that, in a way, you know, a lot of different humans are responsible for. But when some disaster happens partly as a result of climate change, like the rising of waters and increased frequency of storms, then that can disproportionately affect some in comparison with others. And so that disproportionate effect is a kind of classic example of climate injustice, because there's no good reason why, you could say, kind of borrowing an idea from Schrader-Frechette here, there's no good reason why Black people in New Orleans should be especially hurt by Katrina in comparison with others. That happened because of this different position. It's a kind of compounding of being in a vulnerable social position, and then a thing happens that should be ideally of equal negative magnitude for everybody, but it especially badly harms people of a certain identifiable group. Now, to some extent, I've so far focused on these kinds of effects of Katrina, these different effects of Katrina for African Americans in the city. that resulted from a kind of prior different condition of African Americans in the city, not having cars or not having uh, not having resources, financial resources to rebuild houses. But there are also more overt kinds of forces at work that led to a disproportionate treatment. So in 2008, 3 years after the disaster, it was observed on the ground by this person, Quigley, that St. Bernard, one of the neighborhoods, had electricity, water, and a FEMA trailer, and the lower Ninth Ward, which was predominantly African American, had none of those things. So it sure looked like the response from the federal government and other kind of aid institutions was favoring white residents of New Orleans over black residents of New Orleans. You can also think about the difficulty of being able to secure loans may be partly a result of anti-black discrimination. So, it's sometimes hard to really get solid, indisputable evidence of this kind of overt discrimination. Even Quigley's statement here, this is a statement of a single person making an observation. It's not a study of statistics or of the kind of deeper mechanisms at work in the decision making of FEMA and things like that. It's not like the memo from the World Bank, which is a kind of red flag that there's something really overtly and consciously unjust going on. But there is a lot of evidence that there was discrimination about how the aid was distributed. And you can imagine what some of the mechanisms for that might be. I mean, it may be that the people in St. Bernard are more connected with politicians. It's easier for them to somehow advocate for or even like bribe somebody to get something that they want, whereas those in the lower Ninth Ward aren't as well connected. Maybe the people in St. Bernard, it's going to be easier for them to go to the press and be heard and not just be ignored or dismissed for their concerns, whereas those in the lower Ninth Ward, because of the kind of general structural racism and the kind of general racism, or at least like fairly common racism in the society, if they go on the news and complain about things, then some part of the society will just dismiss it as, oh, those poor black people are complaining again. And so there's a lot of evidence that some dimension of the different effects of Katrina on African Americans in comparison with others is because of these larger overt forces of racism.